Good evening. This is Abdus and Jacquie Luqman.
And I am Jacqueline Luqman over here trying to control our dog.
This is the first, as we had said mentioned before. First of all, we'd like to welcome everyone out there in Luqman Nation for joining us this evening. As we had mentioned previously, we are going to do two shows. This is our Wednesday one,
Mhm.
and we would do our regular show on Sunday. Both will be at 6 p.m. Sunday and Wednesday. So if you
Mhm.
want to mark that down, we will be coming live to you. And then, in between then or maybe after then, we may come up with something else, something that might interest us, like we did yesterday
Right.
when we talked about Donald Trump and his continuing racist ways. But in the meantime, we're just going to allow you guys to get your dinner, your tea,
Yeah.
um,
Snack.
yeah, your snack, everything else, and share, invite, subscribe, support us in Patreon,
Mhm.
all of those things, so we can keep this content coming to you, and that we're able to give you the unadulterated truth, which is Luqman Nation. So today, Jackie, we're going to talk about. We're going to finish our discussion that we had on our last show
Mhm.
about reparations and why it's necessary. And we're going to conclude this conversation today. We try not to hold you long, but um, who knows how this will go. So again, Jackie, so what we got on the agenda today?
So on the agenda today, we are going to continue talking about the Urban League's Marshall Plan, because the Urban League's Marshall Plan, in conjunction with like other efforts that have been going on for decades, really um, put to bed the myth that nobody knows how to do reparations, that we haven't figured this out, that we don't, well, if we do reparations, then how do we know how to pay reparations out? Well, if you remember from our last show, the National Urban League has actually, and they don't call themselves the National Urban League anymore. They just call themselves the Urban League. The Urban League has figured this out, and they have figured this out for years. This is nothing new. The Marshall Plan for Black America is a report that the Urban League has published every year since. Let me look at this. Every year, it's been online since 2011, but I think they've actually done the State of Black America shows. There used to be a show that was aired on BET where members of the Urban League and black leaders came together and talked about the state of Black America, very much like the president gets up at the beginning of his at the middle in the middle of his tenure and talks about the state of the union. And then you have governors who do the state of the state. Well, black people have been doing the state of Black America for a long time, and the state of Black America has been dire. The state of Black America has been in dire straits for a long time. So we have had people in our community, in the Black community, working on how to fix this, how to address these issues, and understanding that reparations is like a cuss word to a lot of people. Um, the Urban League came up with the Marshall Plan. And most people who understand and know history know what the Marshall Plan is. It was the plan that was designed and implemented after World War II to rebuild Germany. After the United States bombed the heck out of Germany and practically destroyed its major cities, and the United States government implemented a plan of reparations, of reparative justice to restore Germany. So, since Black Americans have been under siege by our government, since we've been here, we need, and it's not just a need, we demand, it's a requirement we require a plan of restorative justice to restore and repair the black community from the damage that was done to us. And I know a lot of people think that this is like, oh, this is just some ploy for black people to get money. Oh, you just want your check. Or remember, we talked last week about, I don't know why people are opposed or opposed to or offended by black people getting a check from the government when Israel gets a check from the government that is a part of their reparations package to this day. When Japanese Americans who were the survivors of those who were interred in Japanese internment camps, they got a check, paltry as it was, they got a check from the government. And the Department of Defense just got $700 billion. Did anybody bat an eye at the nearly $10 trillion that the same agency just kind of lost? So it flies in the face of logic when people say they have a problem with black people getting a check from the government, but they don't have a problem with anybody else getting a check from the government.
And let's talk about also how it's not just, and I'm glad, Jackie, that you started this off with laying out the case on the reason why the United States even came up with a Marshall Plan, the original Marshall Plan for Western Europe. I mean, after the destruction and stuff during World War II, America was basically one of the last countries standing at this economic powerhouse that the United States wind up becoming after World War II. A lot of it was basically, the Marshall Plan was basically geared to continue to enrich American businesses. Because in order to build, I mean, Germany didn't have any more industry left.
Right, we bombed them.
Right, the British didn't have any industry left because the Germans bombed that.
Right.
The French and all of the, all of the participants in World War II in Western Europe, the Soviets didn't have much of a manufacturing infrastructure left after the Germans invaded them. Japan, forget about it. You know what I mean? So, I mean, American business, this was a gold mine for them. Right. You know, because in order to rebuild these shattered spots around the world, all of this devastation that happened in these countries, it was an opportunity for American businesses and manufacturing to really profit off of rebuilding Western Europe and Japan. And so, and I like the way that you drew that comparison, because slavery was a war on black people. Not only was slavery a war on Africans, and colonialism was a war on the continent. Because anytime that you invade a land and you steal the people, and you kidnap the people, and then you go in and you steal the resources, I mean, that's an act of war. That's one nation or nations being the aggressors on another nation.
Right.
And as we had mentioned before, when we go back to the Berlin Conference, when Europe just decided that Africa was a cake, and that they were just going to carve out pieces of that cake, for exploitation, which is what they did. Millions of Africans died, and we chronicled that in the Congo, and this is modern times. So
right.
We chronicled that in the Congo, where 10 million Congolese Africans were either maimed or butchered just so Belgium could reap profits off of the rubber trade and various other trade that was going on at the time.
Right.
So these are acts of war. And so when you're in it, when you after that type of horrors, our Holocaust, the only course of justice is to repair what you damaged.
Right.
So Jackie and I were talking about this earlier, and there seems to be this conversation being sort of minimized to reparations for African Americans, and that's what we're dealing with now. But when you really talk about reparative justice, as Jacqueline was talking about, we're really talking about reparations that's due to not only African Americans but Africa itself, Africans, and the African those in the African diaspora.
Right. Right. I mean, and we've been having these conversations, which is what people who dismiss the discussion don't know. And because this is just a testament, I think, to how little people don't listen. How little people listen to black people. Because we've been having this conversation and have been trying to push this conversation about reparations in this country for literally decades. And I'm going to show you one of the ways in which, even in progressive circles, because look, we can sit here and talk about the Democrats and the Republicans and the two-party system all day long, but the fact of the matter is, those of us who are outside of the two-party system paradigm right now, we have seen some really troubling behavior among people who call themselves progressives when it comes to black issues. And that's really disingenuous, because these are the same people who were gung-ho for Bernie Sanders being a sponsor of H.R. 676,
yes,
which was John Conyers' bill for Medicare for all, right? Oh, people were just gung-ho about that. But nobody said anything about, well, Senator Sanders, is great that you introduced the Senate companion bill to H.R. 676. So now what are you going to do about introducing a Senate companion bill for H.R. 40? Oh, you don't know what H.R. 40 is? This is the problem. H.R. 40, let me make sure I get my link. There we go. So I can show you. H.R. 40 is a bill that Representative John Conyers has been introducing every year. I have to reduce my window. There we go. So you can see it. Representative John Conyers has been introducing H.R. 40 every year since 1989. And H.R. 40 is a bill that only seeks to study, to examine the institution of slavery in the United States and its early colonies and recommend appropriate remedies. He's been introducing this bill, H.R. 40, every year since 1989, and in January of this year, the 87-year-old lawmaker reintroduced updated legislation for the 115th Congress. H.R. 40 is now titled "The Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act." It's similar to the earlier measure, but has been amended to reflect expanded legal and societal discourse about the transatlantic slave trade and reparations. This is the interesting part of this discussion. I think it's interesting anyway. Dozens of groups ranging from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to the Green Party, big ups to the Green Party, have expressed support for the bill. I am interested to know why progressives haven't gotten on to championing this bill. All of these people in the Green Party who are on this third party kick now, y'all are championing the Green Party, but where are you on pushing H.R. 40 and advancing the discussion about H.R. 40 within the Green Party? Let me scroll down a little bit. For what reparations is, we always think of reparations in the form of cash, right. A check in hand. Well, reparations is repairing or restoring. It's a formal acknowledgement and apology, recognition that the injury continues, commitment to redress, and actual compensation. Here is, I think, where Americans have a problem with reparations. Because see, I'm of the opinion that it's not that people don't know what reparations are.
Right.
People aren't. I think most people aren't stupid. I think some people absolutely are, like intellectually deficient. Oh, no doubt, no doubt. But I think most white people absolutely understand that reparations is not always a check. And even if it is, so what? But most white people really do know that reparations is really just to redress injustices and to repair the injustices. But this is the problem that a lot of people have, the recognition that the injury continues.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because so many people believe that, okay, yeah, two and a half centuries of slavery was awful. It was just terrible. You're not going to get a whole lot of white people who won't agree to that.
Right.
Except for like the truly psychotic.
Yes.
Right? But then it's the part where you say, but the injustices continue and they need to be addressed, and we need redress for those continued injustices. People actually believe in their heads somehow. They have this bizarre wall up in their heads that makes them believe that on the day the Civil War ended, that everything was great.
Right. And then those who think that they're a little bit more enlightened believe that once the Civil Rights Act came,
oh yeah, right,
then everything
right,
was straight.
Yeah, then everything was fine. Everything was equal once the Civil Rights Act. Never mind that if you want to look at the argument about the Civil War, you had 2.5 centuries of the indoctrination of a country toward an entire group of people.
Right. Exactly.
Right. I mean, you had a whole country believing that all of these enslaved African descendants were simultaneously lustful and promiscuous, but they were also physically hideous, more hideous than white people. They were both wise enough to be trained in all of the skilled trades, but they were also just ignorant. They were valuable enough to create patrols to force poor white people to be on those patrols to retrieve stolen property so they wouldn't lose the profit from the property, but they were worthless enough not to be considered human beings. And the overarching idea that everybody was indoctrinated with, as far as black people in this country and around the world, was that people of darker skin were not equal to people of lighter skin.
Right, but the thing of it is that everyone bought into that, right?
Right.
So
right.
first of all, let's put it in that time frame where, number one, the whole institution of slavery
Mm-hmm.
and the slave trade was first of all supported by institutions.
Right.
One institution was the Catholic Church
Mm-hmm.
or Christendom.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was the banking.
Mm-hmm.
The banking, governments,
Right.
European academia,
Insurance companies.
European
Mm-hmm.
academia's insurance company.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, everybody got together and they told themselves that, number one, Africans deserve to be enslaved.
Mm-hmm.
And they deserve to be enslaved because they convinced themselves, or they told themselves, not that they believed it, but it made it. They justify their way of this injustice that they were doing to an entire people.
Right.
So it was like they deserved it because, first of all, if we didn't enslave them, they didn't have a civilization anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew that wasn't true because it was people amongst them in academia and stuff who knew that Africans had a very long history of civilization. As Dr. John Henry Clark once said, that no one has brought civilization to anyone because civilization is the act of being civil. Mm-hmm. Africans were definitely civil,
right,
to each other, and they were civil to Europeans. That's why Europeans was able to do what they did.
Right.
When the first white man got off the boat. And when the Portuguese got there, Africans were very civil to them.
Yeah.
So you didn't bring civilization to anyone. Mm-hmm. And what happened is that the church, governments, mm-hmm. European academia, mm-hmm. Everything in white European society had joined forces to enslave African people. And then once African people got here, then it was then it was fully it was ratcheted up more to say that, well, now the slave labor that we got, and it goes back to what you were saying, Jackie, is the fact now, because now we have even more reasons to do this to these people, because they're ignorant, they're stupid, even though there's so much evidence, as you pointed out, to the contrary. Because how are you going to have a population that you deem to be stupid, yet these are the same people who, through hard work, ingenuity, that you use to basically create, and not only create, but maintain your society, your family.
Exactly.
So I don't really believe that they believe that.
Right.
Right. And that's the thing with racism. I don't even believe that they really believed it. But again, how else could you do those type of crimes to other human beings unless, first of all, you had to dehumanize them? I mean, and that's another part of warfare. You can't drop atomic bombs on the Japanese people unless you remove the humanity from the Japanese people. You couldn't carpet bomb the cities in Germany unless you dehumanize German citizens. You couldn't lynch. You couldn't destroy Black Wall Street and do the things that was done to African Americans in this country and around the world unless, first of all, you dehumanize them.
Right.
So these racialized ideas that was so readily accepted by white Europeans basically helped to bring on the destruction. Well, they tried to destroy black people,
right?
But to put black people in the situation that we're in now. The thing with reparations is the fact that after slavery, the United States government knew that there should be reparations. There were debates that something has to be done. In fact, one a senator back after the Civil War, he tried to push reparations for black people, but it wasn't. It was but of course Congress voted that down. One interesting thing though, Jackie.
What's that?
For all of these people who suggest, because we get a lot of that in progressive circles too, is the fact that that black people felt that in order to succeed in this country, that somehow we needed white patronage, and that we had to have the support of whites. When Sherman went down to Atlanta, and Sherman saw a group of slaves. It wasn't in Atlanta, but when he was down south, Sherman went to a group of slaves, and this was after the war. Sherman asked these slaves. He said, what would you guys, what would you need in order what would you need in order to improve your condition, to improve your life? And I think this was down in Mississippi. And those same enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, this is what they said to Sherman. They said, all we want, first of all, we don't want to live around white people. That was the first thing they said.
This is what the group of formerly enslaved people said after the Civil War.
Right. This is what Sherman had documented, that these formerly enslaved people said, first of all, we don't want to live around white people. Number two, all we want is some land, some tools, and what we need to farm the land, and leave us alone. We will do it for ourselves. Wow. That is what Sherman took that and started taking land away from Confederate in South Carolina. He started taking land away that was formerly owned by Confederates, and he started giving 40 acres and army mules that weren't used anymore to formerly enslaved African people. That's where you get 40 acres and a mule from.
That's where 40 acres and a mule came from.
40 acres and a mule came from Sherman divided up plots of formerly Confederate land in South Carolina, using old army mules to give to the formerly enslaved people to work the land. And it wasn't, that was working until the federal government, I think under Andrew Johnson, president, who overturned all of that, who took all of that away from black people.
Wow.
So don't think that there wasn't understanding in this country at one time that we need to make this right. You know, reparations even went back as far as George Washington. George Washington, even, he tortured himself, along with a lot of other people during this time, but George Washington himself, he tortured himself about what would be the remedy to right the wrong that we did. This was later on towards his life, you know, towards the end of his life. But don't think that that wasn't an understanding, even with some of the so-called founding fathers, that they knew that you could not treat people like this and then let them go, or because George Washington even knew that slavery eventually would have to end because of the contradiction and hypocrisy of what this country had stood for. So he understood that there was gross contradictions in having a land that was established for freedom, and then yet you got almost 4 million enslaved people within your midst. So he understood that once this institution ended, then there has to be a remedy.
Right.
You know, and that was when Thomas Jefferson and others tried to come up with plans to repatriate Africans back to Africa, and all of the colonial society of trying to basically deport its black population back to Africa and wherever they would take us, because Frederick Douglass went down to the Dominican Republic on a fact-finding mission because America was still trying to get rid of us. And they sent Frederick Douglass down there to the Dominican Republic, who wrote a favorable report saying, well, if you're going to send African Americans anywhere, the Dominican Republic seems to be pretty cool. So there was always this understanding about what do we do to repair what we have done.
Wow. So it's interesting. Thank you. See, this is why I got to thank my husband for that, because he, as much as I love history, that guy has more history just kind of in his head. I have to go research stuff because I love history. He just has stuff like in this file cabinet in his head. And when you know that history, that the origins of the 40 acres and a mule, and it wasn't something that, you know, the government said that they were going to do, and it was some nefarious plot to, because, you know, we're big into conspiracy theories now. We love those. That people are doing stuff in secret. No, it was General Sherman asking the formerly enslaved, what do you need? And the formerly enslaved saying, look, just leave us alone. Y'all need to leave us alone. Give us some land and a way to farm the land, and just leave us be, would you please? And Sherman was like, okay, let's do that. But see, we were too, again, with the hypocrisy. Again with the hypocrisy. Yep. We were brought here, our ancestors were brought here against their will. We didn't want to come. Against their will to basically build a country, because that's what we did. We built a country, an economy, and a political system that was the most powerful in the world. But at the same time, we were lazy. As soon as slavery ended and we couldn't be worked for free, we couldn't be forced to work for free anymore, then all of a sudden we were lazy. And here we have, you know, people who are asserting their independence and their own agency, telling General Sherman, look, we just want to do this for ourselves. And instead of the government letting us do that, that's taken away from us.
It's taken away. And given back to the Confederates.
And given back to the Confederates, the former slave owners, the traders and the former, get this for hypocrisy, the former slave owners and the traders were given reparations. They were recompensed for their damages and their losses, including the losses of their slaves.
But let's look at this too, Jackie, is that this just didn't happen in this country too.
Right.
When the British ended slavery in their empire, African slavery, they gave recompense to the former slave owners in the Caribbean.
Right.
You know, so the slave owners, they got their money back from the British Crown. Now, to tell you what an insult this is to African people, on one hand, the British are saying, well, we're going to end slavery. And they had their reasons for doing it. It wasn't out of love for black people, but we'll get into that some later.
Mm-hmm.
But they ended slavery, African slavery, in their empire, recompensed the slave owners,
Mm-hmm.
and then just recently, I believe a few years ago, the British Prime Minister went to Jamaica. And the Jamaican government said, hey, look, man, we want reparations.
Mm-hmm.
And they gave their reasons why.
Uh-huh.
Only for the Prime Minister of Britain to, just thumb his nose at him and said, yeah, well, that's nice, but you're not getting it. So when we talk about reparations, we're talking about this ongoing fight. None of this stuff is going to go away, what we're talking about, until there is until this damage is repaired.
Right.
South Africa, people point to the South African system, and they said, well, they had the conciliation.
Yeah, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Which I commend them for that.
Mm-hmm.
But all that was just for black people to express how they felt.
Right. And for white people to be what's the word I'm looking for? Repentant.
Yeah, it was a way of black people. It was a big national therapy session where black folks who were victims of apartheid, some of them, were able to face their accusers.
Mm-hmm.
And the accusers was on the other side, with their heads down and asking black folks to forgive them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a big therapy session.
Mm-hmm.
Symbolically, yeah, it was a symbolic move. But see, where it fell short at is nobody talked about how they were going to redistribute the wealth. See, the white folks in South Africa, just like white folks in America, they ain't had no problem sitting up there and talking about, yeah, we were wrong, and yeah, we shouldn't have did what we did.
But we're sorry.
Our ancestors, and we're sorry. But yet they walked away with the money. They walked
right.
away with the gold mines in South Africa. The De Beers still was owning the diamond mines.
Mm-hmm.
African workers were still slaving in mines on their land and not getting any. It was still enriching white people.
Mm-hmm.
Nelson Mandela inherited a country that didn't even have money in the bank because the white apartheid South African government made a deal amongst themselves with the bankers that we got to turn this government over because see they understood that a minority white population of 5 million living around a black population of 30 million, they knew that you could not, based on brutality alone, keep that population in check. They knew that.
I did not realize that was the statistics.
5 million white South Africans surrounded by 30 million black South Africans. So they knew that brutality alone was not going to be able to hold that population in check. So they seen this day coming. But what happened was behind the scenes. Now, before Nelson Mandela took over South Africa was a nuclear power. With the help of Israel, South Africa was a nuclear armed power. The white South Africans, and I know we're getting off course, but I want to show you how insidious white supremacy is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All of this talk of kumbaya and all of this talk of going into a new era, the new era was the old era. And what happened was the white power structure came together with the bankers and said, yeah, we'll let Nelson Mandela become president because Khalid Muhammad said one thing. Dr. Khalid Muhammad, if you don't know who he is, Google him. Dr. Khalid Muhammad said one thing. There is no way a man's going to spend 27 years in prison, come out and be president unless there's a script for him to follow.
Wow.
Nelson Mandela understood that he was just a symbolic leader. He understood that. He understood that he wasn't going to have no real power. And so when the white power structure got together and said that we're not going to leave them nothing in the treasury. Nothing.
That was a plan. That's what they actually planned to
do. They
do.
looted the white power structure, looted the South African treasury, which was one of the richest nations on the planet.
Wow.
Not only did they do that, they also said we're getting ready to get rid of the nuclear weapons because we do not want nuclear arms in the hands of black people. Now, before Nelson Mandela became president, South Africa was a nuclear-powered nation with nuclear weapons. But
which they weren't even supposed to have.
Well, no, they had them. They weren't barred internationally from having them. Israel helped them. But what happened was that when the ANC was taking over, then all of a sudden it was like, well, we can't have nuclear weapons in the hands of black people. So it's the same thing over here. What I'm saying is that the symbolism, when you talked about the 40 acres, when we talked about the 40 acres of mule, it's the same symbolism. The symbolism, that's all it is.
Wow.
Whether it's the Civil Rights Act, whether all of this lip service of justice and equality, but what happens behind the scenes is that black progress is always undermined. And that's the example that I'm trying to give.
That is man, that is perfect. Because while the transfer of power in South Africa was done when Nelson Mandela became president.
Right.
You know, it's like the white power structure, the actual power structure, the people with the money. Let him, I mean, really, they literally let him become president, knowing full well that he had no authority to actually make any real lasting change for his people. And he knew that. I think Nelson Mandela, and maybe we have to do another show about this because this is a whole nother conversation. I think that Nelson Mandela made the mistake that a lot of black people make when they believe we've made headway in this whole fight against white supremacy. We are allowed to have a position of authority, and we hope that through our efforts and through our time we can actually make some change. We can eventually change the hearts of the people who hold the actual power. That's a part of what it is, because we're still looking at this from a moral standpoint, right? Not from the cold hard legal standpoint that people. White supremacists use what is at their disposal to maintain power. And the one thing that is at their disposal, aside from money, is the law. So, yeah, they'll let you hold the position that holds these particular rights and privileges. But as we all know with our own government, the president really can't tell a state what they can and cannot do with their budget.
Well, see, but that's the thing, Jackie, and that's the reason why reparations have to include black politics. Because Nelson Mandela, his sole purpose for being president was to what word am I looking for? Was basically to keep South Africa from burning.
Right.
30 million South Africans, man, was ready to burn the country down, man. And white folks knew that. And so what happened was Nelson Mandela was really set in place to appease what they knew was coming. And right over here in this country, black politics alone hasn't. See what I'm trying to get us to see is that political power alone hasn't worked for black people. Politics alone hasn't. Now we have to have politics, but politics doesn't mean nothing if it's only symbolic. Like I told you, in South Africa, they looted the treasury. So now if you go, Nelson Mandela was what, president in the 90s?
Yeah.
You go to South Africa today and you're still seeing entrenched poverty amongst black people. Over here, black people have been emancipated, what, since 150 years ago? But look at our entrenched poverty.
Right.
How many black politicians have we had come and go? We just had Barack Obama. And yet you see that instead of black poverty, instead of black people progressing economically, you see that even under Barack Obama, we went back. Right. You know why? Because all of that, Obama was symbolic.
Right.
Nelson Mandela was symbolic. But it never equaled to any real change. You know why? Because the symbolism, because the people who are put in front of us, they themselves are being controlled by a white power structure. There is no way that the only way that wealth, the wealth disparity between blacks and whites, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Brazil, whether it's in the Caribbean, whether it's in Africa, or whether it is in America, there is no way that we can put this gap together unless somebody got to give something up.
Yep.
And that's where And that is where the resistance from even well-meaning white people come when it comes to reparations. Because there's no way that you're going to have a 250-year head start, and then those that you had a head start on say, okay, we agree that we have to do something. And that's why Bernie Sanders caught hell.
Right.
Because the
right.
thing of it is that he was saying, well, all we have to do is address the inequality of wealth. Well, yeah, that sounds good, except that when you got a group that got 250, 300 years a head start, there's no way you're going to close that gap unless somebody got to give up something.
That exactly.
And that's where the resistance comes in at.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the truth. And I think that goes right back to the very beginning, where you got people who are being resistant because they think, like we said last week, we're going to come knocking on their door. You know, didn't you just buy a new car? Give me that car. That's actually the way people think. Like, they're not going to be able, somebody's going to take money out of their paycheck to give to lazy black people. But y'all don't care that the same people are taking, money for benefits for you and your family, to pay for the Department of Defense to go and bomb other countries. Whether MMT is a thing or not, look. It's not. We don't have a shortage of money in this country. That's obvious. It's obvious that we don't. The DOD just got $700 billion extra dollars. But to your point about white people knowing that something needs to be done, but they don't want to give up anything to actually do anything. Let me show you why I know that's true. Why we know this is true in the United States of America. This is why you need to pay attention to politics, ladies and gentlemen. This is why you can't look at this stuff as it. And now I'm talking to my brothers and sisters, our brothers and sisters, especially my Christian brothers and sisters, because y'all get on my nerves too. Because y'all always talking about, oh, that's so negative. I don't want to, I don't watch the news because that's so negative. I'm just going to pray. While you were not watching the news and not paying attention to politics and just praying, under the Clinton administration and under George Bush, though two administrations now, under two separate administrations, white presidents, have issued symbolic resolutions apologizing for slavery. Remember those?
I remember.
Remember that? We'll find them and post the links to them. They do exist. This governing body of this country did indeed acknowledge the horrors and the wrongs of slavery and what was done to black people, and that the government did it. And yes, Clinton and Bush. But here's the problem. Both of those resolutions included disclaimers that forbade monetary claims. Now, this is where black politics has failed us.
Yep.
Because at the time, and I remember under Bush, I don't remember this under Clinton for some reason, but I do remember this under George W. Bush. I remember watching like all of the black members of the House standing up and applauding this bullshit resolution.
Right.
And then when I actually read it, I was like, why were y'all applauding this? We didn't get jack. We didn't get anything out of this. So, again, further on in this article, we talked about the legal precedent that exists in this country for reparations. All right? And the people who Representative Conyers has met with, because he just held this meeting with this panel of people back in January. And black people, like I said, we've been working on this for decades. In COBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, has existed for, 40 years? I mean, a very long time. There's something, let's see. There's something else I wanted to. Oh, that's right. This is what I wanted to highlight from this article, and then I want to show you something else. And this ties into the problem that I'm having with progressives and the issue of reparations. When the Democrats controlled Congress, Conyers' measure had as many as 70 co-sponsors. Remember, his H.R. 676 has over 100 co-sponsors.
Right.
All right? In a Republican-controlled Congress. In a Democratic-controlled Congress, he could only get 70 co-sponsors at the most.
Yeah, because Democrats, they...
Yeah. But whatever words you want to come up with for the Democrats, that's what they've been. To date, fewer than 24 lawmakers have signed on. Attendees of the conference that he held were urged to contact their congressional representatives and exert political pressure so the bill does not wither on the vine yet again. Remember, since 1989, he's introduced this bill. And every single year he has introduced this bill, it has not gotten out of congressional committee. Now, we do all this phone banking for Medicare for all. We do all this phone banking for all this stuff. Explain to me why the progressives aren't doing a phone banking campaign for this. Because let me tell you why progressives are real shady, really shady when it comes to reparations. You got all these progressives talking about reparations is a bad idea. Again, not talking about Republicans, not talking about white people who don't get it. I'm talking about the so-called people who are supposedly so justice focused.
Right.
This is from the Urban League's Marshall Plan. They have released a report about how to address these issues every year for at least the past 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
The plan, this is from 2017. It was released in May of this year. I hope you guys can see it. Let me see if I can zoom in on a little more. Increase federal funding for public schools with a focus on equity to eliminate resource gaps. Expand the ESSA pre-K program so that every child has access to high-quality full-day pre-K. Double the nation's investment in Pell Grant program. Explain to me what part of the education portion of the Urban League's Marshall Plan doesn't apply to every American.
Yeah, that's true.
All the education reform that the progressives are fighting for, explain to me what they can't find in that they can champion. If that's not enough, jobs in the economy. How about the very first point? Enact a federal living wage of $15 per hour, indexing wages to inflation. Aren't we fighting for 15?
Yep.
Aren't progressives fighting for 15? So why can't they talk about the Urban League's plan and their step to fight for 15? Why can't they incorporate the Urban League's plan in their efforts? Housing and wealth building, expand financial literacy, home buyer education and counseling, broaden access to low-income housing and rental assistance. How about down here to health? Fully fund the Medicaid, Medicare, and Children's Health Insurance Program and prevent a switch to block grants. I'm sorry. I thought Medicare for all was something that y'all really, really wanted. I thought that Medicare for all was the number one issue for progressives. So if Medicare for all is a major issue for progressives, explain to me why you are not helping the Urban League push their agenda. Because isn't it clear that their agenda is your agenda, progressives?
And if the excuse is that you didn't know what the Urban League's agenda was or is, now you know.
So, I mean, I'm looking at this and we see that all of the excuses that people give. Now I gotta make sure, look at my notes, because we're gonna try to keep our time to under an hour, and we're close. And I make sure we get all of the things that make sure we hit everything that we've got. Yeah. So I don't understand how it is that we have all of these arguments against reparations. Every single argument that we've ever heard in our entire lives.
Against black reparations.
Thank you.
It's not no argument against reparations.
Come on, bring it home.
It's against black reparations. Because, look, we already said in our first part of the show, Sunday, all of the excuses folks use, both black and white, use as an argument for why we're not owed reparations. And I'm not shying away from that word owed. Yeah, we're owed. One is, well, you guys were slave. Well, you guys weren't slaves. That's the argument. My family never owned slaves. But we also understand, as Jackie had pointed out on the last show, that it took government intervention to improve the condition of poor whites. Government did that. Not whites just pulling themselves out of the bootstrap. Not by their bootstraps. Not, European immigrants, using their fruit carts and vegetable carts, to get to the next level. Nah, that was government intervened in that, and we gave examples for that.
The New Deal,
right? So then, and
the YMCA,
GI Bill, all of those things that help white people go into the middle class. Then the other argument is used is, well, there's no slaves living today. So if there were slaves living today, yeah, I can see giving them reparations. But those are the arguments that don't understand what generational wealth means. Because see, the reason why we have the wealth inequality gap, the wealth gap that we have, is because Jackie's 4 parents and my 4 parents, and every black person out there who ancestors were slaves, they worked from can't see to can't see.
Yep.
That means sun up to sundown. And their labor did not produce wealth for them. So when we came along, there wasn't no wealth where our family could pass it down and say, well, I worked so hard for General Washington, and this is the fruits of my labor, and passed it down to where a lot of that wealth was passed down to us. As opposed to even white indentured servants who were given land by the government, mind you, who was given land and slaves by the government in places like the Homestead Act and all those other acts that the government came up to help enrich poor whites. They were able to take, and some of them still have that land today. And let me use this as a side thing, because I know we're short on time. We made a comment on here about how people always try to distract us from the reparations argument by saying, well, there's poor whites. All you got to do is go through the Appalachians. All you got to do is go to Pennsylvania, this and that and the other. But let me tell you something. A lot of those poor whites that we talk about, they got land. Yeah. Now, that land, they might not be able to go to the bank and pull out $1 million. But trust me, a lot of that land has been passed down from family, generations to generations. And land is wealth. I mean, Europeans knew that. That's why they came and took everything. So they understood that land was wealth. They understood that giving poor indentured whites land was a way of them to build wealth. They understood that. They understood that taking land away from us. Because, see, that's another thing with the reparations thing. Well, there's no former slaves. But let's talk about this. How many blacks? There was a lot of blacks that got their land dispossessed in this country.
Right.
A lot of black farmers. And some of those black farmers are still being owed by the government for promises that the government didn't make to black farmers. And dispossession of land. They still around. As well as their descendants are still around. So, all of these excuses that we use to not to deny black people reparations, there are none. Because Germany, the World War II ended like almost 80 years ago. Yet Germany still sends reparations to Israel. United States government still give $3 to $4 billion a year to Israel, and the United States didn't have near concentration camp for Jews in this country.
Nope.
But yet they still send Israel $3 to $4 billion. And look, very few Americans complain about that. But when African Americans start talking about, hey, look, we need our inheritance. Then all of a sudden now we want to get technical. We want to get this and we want to get that. There is no excuse not to pay reparations. We can afford it as a nation, and it's the only way to justice. If we're going to put our history behind us, if we're going to put slavery and our racial past behind us, then we got to deal with this.
Yeah, we do. And for those of us on the left in the progressive movement, we have to keep talking about black issues. So there's so much pushback in these progressive circles against black activists and black politicos advocating for black people. If we don't do it, we can't trust anybody else to do it, because time and time again, we've seen that you won't. Our issues will always be put on a back burner, will always be pushed aside, will always be told to wait, and there is no reason for that. We just showed you that every fight progressives say they have, everything they say they are fighting for everybody else, we've been fighting for decades. So why wouldn't you partner with us?
And you know, one of the things, we got 3 people watching now, right? And that's okay, because see, we understood that this kind of talk ain't real sexy. We understood that this kind of talk, man, you know, if Jackie and I were sitting up here talking about the Russia investigation, if we were sitting up here talking about the DNC, if we were sitting up here talking about getting Bernie back in the race again, if we were talking about Trump, all of those things, you know, everybody flocks to that. But we had did a story on our show a couple of weeks ago about black wealth being zero by the year 2053 if things don't change in this country. The reason why Jackie and I advocate for African Americans only, because no other group got that type of statistics coming at them.
No.
None. And so why am I, you know, it is good that we have the allies that we do. But do you understand the dire situation that African Americans are in this country? That in the richest nation on this planet, that if things don't change, that by 2053 we will have zero wealth in the richest nation on the planet. So that's the reason why we advocate a lot for African American affairs, because see, when it wasn't done before in the past, and the civil rights, all the stuff that people point to about the Civil Rights Act, that didn't benefit us. You know why? Because folks back then said in order for black people to have anything, you got to attach a lot of other stuff to it. Other people should benefit too. So there was never a specific agenda that was taken up by the American government specifically for African Americans. Any gain that we ever got in this country had to include others.
Yep.
And in the long run, what has happened? The others wind up benefiting more from it than us.
Every single time.
All right, you take the last couple minutes. I'm done.
Dang it. We never have enough time to talk about every single thing we want to talk about. That's why we have to go to 2 shows a week, because we do have to have these conversations. And as we kind of figure out which platform is the best, I don't know, we'll figure it out. We do appreciate you joining us live. We do appreciate you sharing our videos. We appreciate the comments you leave, and do leave comments. But subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook. Consider becoming a patron on Patreon. We're about to set up our shop, so you can purchase all kinds of nifty Luqman Nation merchandise, and join us again on Sunday at 6 p.m. for another episode of Live in Luqman Nation. Oh, and follow us on Twitter at Luqman Nation 1, the number 1. Hey, thanks a lot for joining us, everybody. This is Jacqueline Luqman.
And I'm Abdus and Jacquie Luqman. Calming down.
And that was Brewski Luqman having words with our neighbor's dog. Peace out, y'all. Have a great evening. Be good to each other. Thanks for joining us.
Baltimore is burning, but as the fires continue to burn, people here left asking if the police have done enough and whether this violence is really about the death of 25-year-old Freddie Gray.
It has been a night of chaos, violence, lawlessness in Baltimore over the death of Freddie Gray.
Right now, the National Guard is on the scene trying to restore peace. And as we said, all public schools are closed today.
On Sunday, April 12th, Gray was taken into police custody. The arrest once again captured by a bystander's cell phone.
Hey, that boy leg look gross.
Gray seemingly in pain and screaming, unable to walk, as officers drag him into a transport van. Reportedly, when he arrived at the police station a half hour later, he was unable to breathe or talk. Medics rushed him to the hospital. A few days later, he slipped into a coma and then later died from a severe spinal injury.
Baltimore's poverty rate is nearly double the national average.
The unemployment rate among young African-American men hovers around 30%.
High school graduation rates for black males are devastatingly low.
A lack of access to labor markets, healthcare, housing.
It has chronic severe drug and crime issues.
One of the highest violent crime rates in America.
Since 2011, the city of Baltimore has paid out close to $6 million in court judgments or settlements to victims of police abuse.